Welcome everybody to New Acropolis. And for those of you who don't know, we're a school of philosophy in the classical tradition, which basically means we look at how philosophy was lived in classical times, which puts an emphasis on the practical aspect of it, sort of to understand the teachings by practicing them and gaining knowledge from our experience. So it's a different approach from a purely academic one. When you learn something through doing, it becomes yours. And through these ancient teachings, we're given tools that guide us, I suppose, on this path of self-discovery. We look at timeless ideas and, how we can use them to learn to think more for ourselves, which is, I guess, often kind of difficult in the world we live in. For those of you that don't know, New Acropolis, it's an international organization. In Ireland, we have schools in Rathmines and Bray. Everyone who works in the school is a volunteer. We're interested in sharing the teachings that we've learned and have inspired us. And normally these classes would be face-to-face on the public talk. So this is our first virtual talk. It's a new platform for us as we adapt to the changing circumstances we're all in. So, bear with us if there's any technical issues. So we're here today to listen to a talk on Plato and the myth of the cave, which Aidan Murphy will be given. And just briefly, just a few little housekeeping things to go through. The talk will be about 40 minutes or so, with approximately 10 to 15 minutes at the end for any questions that people have. If you have questions, it's best to just post them in the chat. You'll see there's a little chat box up in the top right-hand corner, and you can just type the questions in there, and we'll collect them, and then we'll go through as many as we can in the time at the end. It's probably a good idea if people mute themselves during the talk. Most of you are muted now anyway, just so we're not getting any noise in for the speaker. If anybody has any technical problems throughout, we're going to post a phone number to ring that'll just be in the little chat rather than interrupting the speaker. And just to let you know as well, we're recording this, recording the talk for ourselves. So I think that's everything. So I guess I'll just hand over to Aidan, who's going to give the talk.
Hello, everybody. I think I froze there for a second. Okay, well, we'll see how we do. It's an interesting perspective here. I have many windows in front of me. It's kind of like that old game show, Celebrity Squares. You have all these windows with people sitting in them. So I can see some people there. So yeah. If you can see tiles as well, you can change the layout just in case you want a bigger picture of me, I guess, just so that you can see what I'm saying. I'm not selflessly promoting myself, but just so that it's clear. And as Connor mentioned, any questions, just pop them in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. So the talk that we've put forward today is on Plato's myth of the cave. My objective with this subject is to outline what is a very old teaching, 2,500 years old, of Plato's, but certainly in the times that we're living today, we can observe a lot of similarities, interestingly, and that in that way we can extract a lot from it for ourselves, individually, collectively, and historically, to understand a little bit the world and the times that we're living in. To help with that, we'll look at a couple of contemporary reference points. So some ways in which this allegory has inspired popular culture, and also how the central themes of the myth or the allegory reflect a lot of the historical developments of our recent times. So before we go into the meat of the subject, I'll introduce very briefly Plato himself to help us understand his ideas and his worldview that informed this myth of the cave. As a philosopher, Plato, certainly being one of the most well-known philosophers, has certainly left a legacy of ideas that have impacted the world for centuries. The myth of the cave, as one in particular, is actually an aspect of a larger text that he wrote, The Republic, which is one of his masterpieces, really, a dialogue that is examining the highest ideas and ideals of the social dimension of collective living. Plato himself, he was born in 428 BC. He was born into the upper ranks of Athenian aristocracy, so he would have had a pretty good station in life. He would have been afforded, well, the best of certainly in a position to enter into political life in Greece, in Athens. So engaging in political life was something that was of interest to Plato. He was idealistic. He had a great passion for social justice, and with that, he had also some family members that were serving in political office at the time. But what he could see from early on was that those governing were not that preoccupied with the idea of justice. So he became somewhat disillusioned by the political system that was in place, and he would actually ultimately find his real influence, his real master outside of politics in the figure of Socrates. Some of you may know Socrates a little bit. Plato, as a young man, would have encountered Socrates in the agora of Athens, in the public squares of the city, where people met to share ideas, to dialogue, to discuss. And there Plato found Socrates entering into dialogue with the youth of Athens, challenging their opinions, asking them questions, provoking them to think for themselves and not to simply accept what they were being told. He would have also been engaging in this kind of dialogue, this intellectual discussion with the intellectuals of the time, the sophists, who he very expertly challenged with his questioning. So Plato would work very closely with Socrates for about, and if you don't know the story of Socrates, sorry for the spoiler, but he was ultimately put to death by the Athenian state for crimes against the city. He was accused of trying to manipulate the youth of Athens. But this, as you can imagine, was a great blow to the young Plato, who would actually leave Athens for a period. He went to travel, to study, and to write. When he returned to Athens, he established his famous school, the Academy, where he was able to put forward his system of education and work with many of the great philosophers of the time to come through those halls, most notably perhaps Aristotle. Plato continued to teach and to write then for the rest of his life until he passed away of natural causes around the age of 80. And that gives us a very synthetic overview of his biography. But what we can understand here also is that the times that he lived and the world that he saw and was a part of helped to shape a lot his philosophy and his political views in regards to society at large. In terms of his writings, we can classify them in a number of ways, chronologically, thematically. What I'm going to focus on here, to keep it simple, is ethics and politics as two key ideas that he talks about. Ethics for Plato is a lot along the same lines of what Socrates talked about, the cultivation of virtue as a means of being happy. But the political dimension never really left Plato's consideration. And he explains, in fact, that they're both intimately linked, ethics and politics. The way that he put it was that for a just city to exist, there has to be just individuals. And so there's no real separation between them. But in these terms, it's maybe useful to understand what we mean by politics. We're talking about the philosophical concept of politics, which we can look at the etymology of the word polis in Greek, where the word comes from, polis meaning city. So we're not talking about political parties, political ideologies. For Plato, the idea of politics is related to the city and to citizenship, or civic responsibility is another way of putting it. So the Republic then that he wrote is a treatise on citizenship and civic responsibility, civic life. Res publica, meaning of public affairs. Some have accused Plato of being utopic with the Republic, that he's presenting kind of a perfect world, impossible to achieve. But it's a distinction to make. It's not quite utopic. It's more that he's presenting an ideal state. He's presenting a model or a blueprint that can help us to understand what we can develop to create a better collectivity. So this, gives us something to reflect on. It's not that this is what we have to transform the world into overnight, but at least there are keys here that help us to understand a little bit the world that we're living in and what we can improve. And when we look at what Plato writes, what is fascinating is how relevant it remains 2,500 years later. Because what we can observe is that then, as much as now, people were contending with social manipulation. We have what we call fake news now. This is the big thing, but we didn't invent the concept of fake news, of social manipulation. What we've done is we've developed very sophisticated systems of technology to disseminate this fake news. But social manipulation has existed for thousands of years. In Athens at the time of Plato, there were these spin doctors. That's what we call them now. Back then, they were sophists. Those who would spin the truth. They would present things that maybe seemed like the truth, but were manipulations of the truth in order to suit a particular agenda. The sophists were part of a kind of an elite class of intellectuals that would have been involved in a lot of the political and educational life of the city. So a large extent of what Plato is addressing is the challenge that we face in seeing through the haze of spin, in cutting through this manipulation, this fog that is created by those who are controlling the agenda, the messaging. So there's an external element that Plato is talking about in the collectivity. But as his emphasis is always on the social and the individual, he says that for a just city there needs to be a just individual. There's also in the myth of the cave this idea of an inner spin, if you like, an inner cave that we're also contending with. So what is that? What is our inner spin? Well, it's the stories we tell ourselves. It's the white lies, it's the excuses, it's the justifications that we make. It can be the judgments also that we project onto others in order to excuse our own limitations. We can also refer to these influences as preconceived ideas or opinions, which many philosophers have referred to as ignorance, or also elements of our conditioning, because we have been conditioned, all of us, by our environment to think a certain way, to react a certain way. But it's an opportunity for us to reflect on that and to, in a way, challenge the preconceived ideas of our conditioning. What's our conditioning? Well, to use a textbook definition, the dictionary says that a person's condition is their situation with respect to their circumstances. So that's nice and broad, which is interesting because it suggests that we are conditioned by many factors. We're influenced by many elements. And these range from our education to our family upbringing, our cultural background, religious influences. These are all elements of the environment that contribute towards shaping our worldview. And they contribute to a largely unconscious influence in us, a way that we filter things. This is how we perceive and process things based on these influences. And it influences us more the less we're aware of it. If we're not aware of our conditioning at all, then we're unconscious of how we are motivated by these internal elements. So conditioning is where we come from, what we inherit psychologically from our family, from our parents, our culture, our country. Does that mean it's good or bad? Well, it's really just an accumulation of external factors. It's neither good nor bad. It is what it is. What's important is to understand it, because only through understanding it can we determine what's valid and how does it impact the way that we act in the world. And the reality is that our conditioning tends to influence our decision-making and our behavior much more than we realize. But all of this conditioning, is this who I am? That's the question to ask ourselves as well. Am I defined by my culture, by my country, by my language, by all of these elements? Or is the human being something more than just that? We can choose to define ourselves in that way. We can choose to identify purely with our nation. And of course, you know, where we come from is going to contribute a lot to who we are in how we see things and what we've experienced. But beyond our conditioning, there is something else that the human being can identify with, and a sense of individuality that is fundamental to us, which in reality, the philosophers suggest can only be discovered through an education that helps us to know ourselves, as Socrates would say, to see what we identify with beyond external circumstances, what is fundamental to us, which would really, in a synthetic sense, be our values, beyond these influences of an external nature. So what conditions us? Well, we can identify with it, but we can also identify with a lot of external things. We can define ourselves by the car that we drive or what we do professionally. But those things don't tell us much about who we are either. So beyond these external things, influences of conditioning, what Plato is describing is a journey that we can take outside of our conditioning, that we journey outside of this inner cave of what is known, of what is familiar, what is comfortable. And in the myth of the cave, he reflects this journey outside of the shadowy realm of ignorance into at least pursuing the sunlight of the truth. And of course, then he parallels this both as an individual journey and as a collective one. So what is the myth of the cave itself explain? What is the allegory? What is the story? What Plato describes is a scenario where a number of prisoners are held in a cave, and they've been in this cave their entire lives. They know no other reality. And in the cave, they're fixed in place. So if you can imagine, they're chained in place with their backs to the wall, fixed in such a way that they can't move, they can't look around. All they can see is the opposite wall of the cave. And that opposite wall is almost like a blank canvas. It acts kind of like a cinema screen. There's nothing there except the shadows of projections that are dancing across this blank wall. And unbeknownst to the prisoners, these shadows are projections that are being created by a fire that's high above and behind them. But all they can see are the shadows. They can't see where the shadows are coming from or who's manipulating the images that are creating these shadows. And so for the prisoners in the cave, this shadowy reality is all they've ever known. And they have no knowledge of the possibility that there could be a reality outside of the cave. The allegory then goes on to describe the journey of the philosopher who is able to awaken them and progressively start to emerge from the cave in pursuit of the truth outside of the cave. What Plato describes is that leaving the cave is, in itself, it's no mean feat. To leave our cave of assumptions or opinions, it requires a bit of courage. Because it takes courage to challenge preconceived ideas, individually or collectively. But it also requires what's very important for the philosopher, which is humility. Because it requires humility to accept that we don't know, that there is an element of ignorance that we want to step out of. Because humility is what allows us to accept that we don't have all the answers, so that we can start investigating. We can start asking better questions. Socrates famously said that if I am wise, it is because I know that I do not know. So what he is highlighting is the importance of acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, so that we're open to discovering new perspectives. This can be tricky for our poor little ego. We have a tendency unconsciously to think that we already know, generally driven by comfort, because if we convince ourselves that we already know, then we don't have to make any kind of an effort to find anything new. And so we reinforce our ideas then with our own opinions, and we convince ourselves that we've figured it out. So that's why it takes a little bit of courage and a little bit of humility to start asking ourselves these questions and observing a little bit how that realm of ignorance or unconscious opinion is affecting us, is directing our behavior. And what Plato also reminds us is that this journey of the pursuit of knowledge is, above all, practical. Like Connor was saying at the beginning, that philosophy in the classical tradition has always promoted a practice, a means of understanding knowledge in order to apply it, not just to admire it. Because the tendency is that we accumulate knowledge for knowledge's sake, without necessarily using that knowledge to change the way that we behave, which is why there's often a discrepancy between the intellect and action, between the way that we think about things and the way that we actually act in the world. And if we become entrenched in our opinions, then everything becomes about opposition, that all that matters is that I'm right, that I have to convince people that I'm right, that I have to show that I'm right, that I have to be seen to be right. So again, humility is important to help us to stay away from sophism, because that's where sophism really takes hold, is where people think that they have to be right. There's no compromise, there's no understanding. Okay, so if we say then that we are at least making the effort to accept our ignorance, and it's important also to understand ignorance. Ignorance is not a criticism or an insult to anyone. Please understand this, because we may think that that's saying, well, oh, I'm ignorant, so I'm stupid. But no, we're not talking about intellectual or intelligence as a capability. Ignorance is simply, it's what we ignore. It's what we don't know about ourselves, about the world. And nobody knows everything. So it's fine to accept, to admit that there is ignorance, that I am ignorant about something. And it's only really through accepting that I'm ignorant about it that I can then start to correct that. So philosophically, then we can understand this symbol of the cave as an inner cave, as this realm of our ignorance, our lack of knowing in some regard. It can be a realm of rigid opinion as well that we use to protect ourselves. So that can become something that limits us, because we self-protect and we kind of chain ourselves to the cave with our own opinions. But so if we can unshackle ourselves from those preconceived ideas and engage in the ideal of stepping out of our comforts, out of our opinions, then we can start to discover little by little small truths about ourselves, about the world around us, about others. And so we can see, as Plato would say, we can start to see things in the light of the sun of reality instead of cast by the light of the fire of the cave. So it's a very rich symbolism rich kind of imagery that he uses, and it's something that has inspired a lot of other stories interpreted in various ways over the years. Most recently, and to a lot of success, popular in pop culture, was the movie The Matrix, which people may have seen. I can see some nodding, so people know The Matrix. I won't go into too much spoiler territory, but just to outline a little bit the correlation between the movie and the myth. In The Matrix, we have a situation where people are born into captivity. They're trapped in this false reality, unaware that they are slaves to machines. So already it's quite a striking statement that the Wachowskis are making with this movie. And then in this world, we have our hero, Neo, who knows that there's something wrong. There's something wrong with the world that he's living in, but he can't quite place it until the enigmatic Morpheus comes to him and presents him with a choice, which you'll remember if you've seen it, the famous red pill, blue pill sequence. The blue pill will allow him to go back to sleep, to forget that he had questions about the Matrix and to go back to a comfortable life. And the red pill, conversely, will lead him on a journey outside of the Matrix and to reality. So it's an interesting interpretation of the myth. It gets the Hollywood spin and there's lots of action, but at its essence, it has a very interesting way of expressing the same ideas that Plato wrote about. And it encapsulates it nicely in this choice between the blue pill and the red pill, which is an invitation for all of us to reflect a little bit. What choice do we make every day? Because every day there's multiple choices that we make. And there's always a blue pill and red pill moment where we can choose if we go with the easy route, the path of least resistance, whatever is motivated by our inner cave, our unconscious desires, or we take the red pill option and we exercise something a little bit more, maybe a little bit of courage, a little bit of will, a little bit of determination, whatever it is that pulls us out of that cave so that we can make that heroic effort in something. These can be big things or they can be small things. It doesn't really matter. We have plenty of examples, but we're being challenged constantly by life to see which pill are we taking, which option are we making. And so we can observe then what influence our conditioning has over us. And I'm sure you've probably noticed, what that voice is, that voice that wants the path of least resistance, that assures us that it's not worth it. It's too much effort. Just take the blue pill. And what happens when we follow that voice? In general, when we follow that voice, we avoid what's difficult. We avoid what's confrontational. We avoid what challenges us. Ultimately, we avoid ourselves. And we could say in the Platonic sense that we avoid reality because we're choosing to continue to shackle ourselves to the comforts of the cave and not face what we need to face. And I think this is something particularly interesting for us to observe now in our current circumstances. We have a great opportunity to reflect on these things in this, environment of confinement, in the lockdown, whatever we want to call it. We're here in a way disrupted from our normal comforts, our normal routines, A lot of our conveniences have been taken away. A lot of the triggers of our kind of external distractions have been limited. So there's an opportunity for us to observe ourselves and to see, what are we extracting from this experience? How am I experiencing this? Am I avoiding it? Am I filling the void with Netflix? Or are there questions emerging that I could outside of all of this, beyond my comforts and beyond the system that we've become so used to, so dependent on? Who am I? So there is this inner cave that we can come to terms with. But the allegory does have a dual meaning. Plato is also describing in the myth these unseen figures, the puppeteers in the cave, that are manipulating the images across the fire to create the shadow reality that the prisoners are observing. They create this puppet show in order to placate the prisoners and to keep them trapped in their ignorance. Plato calls them the masters of the cave. And this was him taking a shot at the sophists of the time. But we can certainly lay the same claim at the feet of the modern sophists, our spin doctors of today, those that use the modern cave, the platforms of media, social media, advertising, etc., to present a certain worldview, a certain illusion of life, in order to keep people trapped in their ignorance. So again, it's an interesting correlation. 2,500 years later, what Plato is describing, we're still contending with it. But in more recent history, there's a particular example of this to help us understand how it came to this for us today. A relatively unknown historical figure named Edward Bernays. You may have come across him. He features in a documentary that was made in 2002 by Adam Curtis called The Century of the Self. And in this documentary, Curtis explains how Bernays' influence in the 20th century helped to kind of pave the way for a lot of the systems of manipulation that exist through advertising and politics in the world today. Bernays himself was a nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he started his career working in propaganda for the Americans during World War I. And he was a part of a team that helped to create this message, this image of America as the great liberators of Europe and the heroes of democracy for all nations. And it was an incredibly successful campaign because it really redefined America's relationship with the rest of the world. But after that, he could see that there was a niche opportunity to use propaganda to sell things to consumers. This was his kind of takeaway from observing the power of mass persuasion. And at the same time, his uncle, Sigmund Freud, was suggesting at the time radical ideas about the human condition and the unconscious. So Freud's position was that he believed the root of all human decision-making contained largely unconscious desires, generally sexual and violent in nature, and that the role of society was to keep these impulses in check through some kind of an external moral system. That's very synthetic interpretation of psychoanalysis, but it shows the influence that Bernays then had in his interpretation of that. He sees it as an opportunity to create marketing, because if he can tap into these irrational unconscious forces in people, and if he can bypass rational dialogue and create an emotional link between people and products and services, then he can compel people to buy things they don't need in order to satisfy desires they didn't even know they had. And so the basis of psychoanalysis becomes the basis of marketing and advertising as we understand it today. This idea becomes very popular very quickly in post-World War I America, because in the West now there's a shift where the capitalist systems are in danger of starting to produce things at a rate that will outpace demand. Up to this point, people would buy things based on how they work. Will they work? Will it last a long time? Is it functional? It was very utilitarian. You bought a pair of shoes because they would last time, but this wasn't creating enough demand. So the big corporations decided they had to shift the dynamic to encourage people to want things, not just need them for their practical function. And so the relationship changed, where now people were encouraged to buy things because of style, because of appearance, not because you need it, but because you will feel better when you have it. And so this creates the relationship that we're more associated with now, that people identify with their possessions. People are happy if they have things. Now, of course, this is not the first time in human history that people have confused happiness with possession, but this is certainly how, in our era, it becomes very popularized and part of the mainstay. So this influence then has created that relationship where identity is trapped in possession. We're no longer human beings, we're human havings. And in a way, we become mobile caves, going around with our own illusions that we can be anything, that we can do anything, without realizing that it's an illusion of a lifestyle that has been created by corporations to sell things. Now, of course, this whole Freudian concept of the unconscious is very popular outside of just the marketing dynamic that I'm describing. And many believe that this is human nature, that Freud is right, and that we're only driven by unconscious, instinctive and animalistic drives, and therefore human nature can't really be trusted. And so it explains the idea of what some refer to as social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, that only those who can control themselves should control others. Some will say that, but the concept is in a way a sophism. It's not an entire truth. It's a partial truth that is presented as a truth. And with that, then we can justify any kind of behavior. But where the sophism is in saying that human beings are only driven by unconscious forces. Because of course we can't say that we're not. We're driven by many unconscious forces. But it's not the sum total, it's not the exclusive motivation that is driving the human being. We have instincts, undeniably, instincts of preservation, procreation, and these are necessary. It's part of our evolution. But beyond that aspect of the human nature, we can call it the animal self within the human being. There's a higher aspect as well. There's another dimension to the human being, a dimension that is driven more by values, by justice, by altruism, by love, by courage. That aspect that is timeless in the human being, that goes beyond the instincts. This has been characterized as many things by different traditions: the higher self, the inner self, the spirit, consciousness, intelligence, the conscience. There's many different ways that we can refer to this. But all these traditions are explaining that there is more to the human being than simply an accumulation of instincts that were the necessity of our evolution. In the same way that the human being is more than the sum total of our conditioning. And so, in a way, we have, again, the red pill, blue pill dynamic. We have a choice. We can choose to go with the path of what is instinctive, or we can choose to adhere to something higher in us, our higher ideals or sentiments of what is good and noble. And ultimately, that's always a choice, regardless of the circumstances. And this isn't always easy because the circumstances can be very difficult, and it may be hard to even see where there is a choice. So it's not always easy, but there is a choice, and circumstances alone do not define our decisions. We choose. And people may say that, you know, we're hardwired for instinctive behavior. That's it. It's our self-interest that determines everything. And even if it's true that we are hardwired instinctively, we have the ability to rewire ourselves, to reprogram ourselves. That's what Plato called, in a way, the role of education. Educare, to bring out the best in the human being. It's to bring out our latent potential, that we awaken this awareness of these two choices and ultimately these two paths, where the blue pill is a path of the ego, of individualism. I'll do only what I like and when it suits me, versus the other path, the red pill, which is more a path of solidarity, that we are working together towards the future. Also, just in terms of how sometimes these things are presented to justify instinctive behavior, I see a lot now people referring to human animals, that we are human animals as a way of classifying the human being. But no, we're human beings. We have animalistic tendencies, we instinct, yes. But ultimately we have the capacity to transcend those instincts through education, to civilize ourselves, to emerge from that instinctive behavior and to make conscious choices. This is the path that philosophy proposes as a way forward for humanity. That we learn and we evolve, and we do it together as a shared journey. It's a more inclusive proposition, that we can learn from each other, that we can ultimately help each other. The alternative that we see in the world is a path of exclusion. It's a path of excessive competition, of judgment, of superiority, where the likes of Bernays decides who has the right to think, and that everybody else has to be told how to think or what to think. Philosophically, everybody can think, but we have to learn how to think for ourselves. So the objective of philosophy really is to liberate the human being so that we can think for ourselves and by ourselves. And so that being able to, we can choose to act in accordance with our conscience. The alternative Bernays proposes, and others like him, is that people should only think in accordance with their desires so that they can be more easily manipulated. Unfortunately, we can observe that this latter approach is more prevalent in the world today. And there's many historical reasons for why that's the case. But one case that Curtis makes in the Century of the Self documentary is that it's a kind of a convergence of ideas that emerges after World War II. The ideas that Bernays and those of his ilk had starts to permeate into politics. Because after the devastation of World War II and the world is kind of reeling from shock after the atrocities of what happened in Europe emerges, Freud, for one, certainly feels vindicated in his theories that these unconscious forces in the human being are dangerous if unregulated, and that at a mass level they can produce devastation within a country if people are not controlled. So it starts to make leaders of nations worry a little bit, that they can't trust the very people that have put them in power. And it seems to present a potential flaw in democracy, that the masses can't be trusted to make decisions for themselves. This is the interpretation that people like Bernays start to take, and they start to suggest that we need to start controlling people to make sure this doesn't happen again. again, it's two options. Instead of educating the masses to make better decisions, the road was chosen to simply control people so they wouldn't make decisions. So Bernays says this, and he wrote this in a book that he wrote called Propaganda, which is available to buy, to read, to see what his ideas were like. And this is a quote from his book. He says, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country." So this leads to the concept of engineering of consent, which becomes the kind of the movement of bringing advertising principles into politics. This is how Bernays assured people that we could safeguard democracy by arousing the desires of the masses through unconscious manipulation and satisfying those desires through consumption, so that it would create a kind of almost kind of a national sedative. It would create a state of dullness in the people that as an electorate, everybody would be part of a perfect democratic state, docile, malleable, and conformist. And he was very clear that this was for their own good. But this became very popular very quickly. And market research agencies started being hired wholesale by politicians to plan their campaigns. Market research focus groups that were used for advertising started to be used for political campaigns. Things like the Gallup poll was born, where these huge surveys were taken to gain people's opinions in order to shape political messages to match those opinions. This is all very normal now. We're very used to political polling and gauging opinions and all these things. But is it used to hear the voice of the people, or is it used in order to tailor a message to sound like it's appeasing the voice of the people? So what we see is that the same challenges that Plato outlines remain. How do we extract ourselves from external influences and social manipulation? And the reality is the solutions remain the same too. We have to get out of the cave. First, we have to get out of the inner cave. We have to challenge our own preconceived ideas and assumptions. Because when we understand ourselves a little bit better, we can understand the world better. We can observe better how these external influences are impacting us. How are they influencing our behavior? And in that way, we can become a little bit more independent of these influences. We become a little bit more autonomous. Or the Stoics would say we gain freedom because we're less impacted by external circumstances. And in a way, we become a little bit corruptible, a little less, the manipulations of the world around us affect us a little bit less. Because now we can see how they influence us. And we can intervene when they influence us, so we can step back and not be so affected by the messaging that's coming at us. We will always be affected by the environment. There's no escaping it. We are part of the world. And as long as we're part of the world, we will be influenced by the world around us. But at least becoming more conscious of that influence, we can intervene when it is directing us in a negative way. Like, back to the story, back to the myth of the cave for a second. This is the prisoner's journey outside of the cave. So he gets out into reality, into daylight. What does he see first? Well, he sees the sky, and it's blue. And he sees the grass, which is green. And the sun itself is this brilliant ball of light in the sky. reality is spectacular, but it's also difficult to comprehend. After so long in the dark, it takes time for the prisoner's eyes to adjust. And it's the same for us. It takes time for us to adjust to reality, to step out of our ideas, our opinions. So it's important to understand that it's not immediate, and it requires a little bit of an effort, because it can be difficult to challenge our opinions, to step out of a false vision that we had of ourselves, to let go of those attachments of how we perceived ourselves. But in this sunlight that Plato's describing, the sunlight of reality and realization, slowly we can start to disentangle ourselves from these opinions that we've chained ourselves to for so long. And then we can start to see things as they really are. The truth, the reality that was always there, but we just couldn't see it. This process in itself, it brings what the philosopher calls a kind of a melancholy. There can be a certain sadness there, because we're confronted with the reality of who we are, of where we're at. It's not always easy to be confronted with that, or to let go of who we thought we were. But in the, getting through the melancholy phase, there is a catharsis in that letting go, which brings a sense of rejuvenation, of rebirth. The tendency is that we experience the difficulty, the sadness, we're confronted with the reality, and it's unpleasant, so we run away. We go back in the cave. So we need to work with that process of, in a way, letting go. It's in a way like a grieving process. We have to die to who we were, or who we thought we were, in order to be reborn to who we are, or who we could be. Otherwise, we stay in the cave. But the reality is, and we can see this in any situation really, there is no transformation, there is no growth without a little bit of pain. Even when we're growing up, the physical body can have growing pains. Everything requires a movement that creates a friction for there to be growth. And inside, it's the same. In becoming who we are, in shedding these layers of preconceived ideas, there can be a little bit of pain. But it is a necessary part of life. It is part of transforming so that we can become our true selves. And in the face of those choices, again, the blue pill, red pill, the philosopher's choice is always to accept what the Buddhists would talk about, the necessity of a little bit of suffering in order to gain in consciousness. And so there is a need for us to come out of that comfort so that we can engage in the process of investigation and transformation. So how do we do that? Well, again, we can use our story, or Plato's story, to help. What does the prisoner do next? They're out of the cave. They've adjusted to the light. It's a beautiful sunny day, much like today. They have a cool, refreshing breeze. The ground looks soft and inviting. So what do? Well, they lie there like a manatee. No, of course not. That's a terrible end to the story. What they do is what Neo does in The Matrix, if you remember the movie. What does he do? He gets out of the cave, and then he goes back into the Matrix. So if there is a philosophical ideal that Plato outlines as this journey of the individual exiting the cave, then there is also what he describes as the political ideal of returning to the cave to help others. This is how investigation becomes transformation through service to others. This is what in Eastern thought they called karma yoga. So in applying what we're discovering about ourselves, about the world, in applying it in daily life, not only for ourselves, but for others, through practicing generosity, determination, courage, compassion, understanding, and above all, through applying it, through action, and not waiting for others to do it for us. Through all of this, we can transform ourselves into what Plato calls the best that we can be. Of course, Plato says that it's not easy. For the prisoner returning to the cave, now again their eyes have to adjust, but this time to the dim light of the cave. Because when we discover something new, it can be difficult for us to relate to people who still think the way we used to think about things. But we shouldn't judge that. Nor should we expect people to welcome us with open arms when we're there to tell them something that they don't want to hear. Because in the cave, the prisoner tries to explain that their reality is false, that everything they've ever believed is a lie. You can imagine it doesn't go down well when he says that everything is not what they believe, what they see. And the other prisoners say, "What are you talking about? The sky is blue. It's clearly gray. The grass, it's green, it's gray. Everything's gray. What are you talking about?" So we have to understand also that ignorance is always going to resist when it is confronted with reality. But again, it's important not to judge people for this, because we're not such bastions of wisdom that we don't fall into the same trap. We still have preconceived ideas, opinions. We still have ignorance. So it's important not to judge people if they don't understand the things that we understand, if they don't see life the same way that we see life. But what is important in what Plato suggests in the political ideal is that even with our imperfection, even with our ignorance, we go back to the cave. To put it another way, we share what we have learned and experienced. It's not perfect, but we all have something that we can share from what we have learned and experienced. Not so that we can be seen to be so good. We're not preaching, we're not proselytizing, but to help others, to show an example, to demonstrate that there is a viable alternative to the cave. This active concern for others is what Plato talks about with citizenship. That our civic responsibility is an active engagement in a sense of solidarity with each other. That we're all in this together and that we're all responsible for each other. That as long as even one person is a prisoner in the cave, we're all prisoners. Now, of course, we can't drag people out either. We can't impose any way of living or thinking on anybody. A lot of people aren't going to want to leave the cave. It's difficult, and it can be a big shock to see things a different way if we're not ready. But what we can observe at the same time is that crisis tends to shake people, and we have to be prepared for the crisis that we're living now to awaken a lot of questions in us and in others. That we have a tremendous opportunity here to revise the way that we're living. And that philosophy can offer us some guidance, keys on that path that we're traveling to help give us direction. Nobody proposes an answer, the definitive answer. If they do, I'm a bit wary of that. But at least these different traditions that we can observe and how they dealt with the same challenges in different ways, or I should say, similar challenges that had different expressions in their time, they propose things that we can learn from and that we can try and apply now. So again, it's a remarkable thing to me, the correlations that we can see, the relevance that the myth of the cave still has 2,500 years later. We're facing unique circumstances today in the situation that we're living, that we're experiencing. But ultimately, the way that we will come out of this is the same as what Plato is advising then. That we learn to think for ourselves, that we lessen the impact of external influences, that we work to discover the best in ourselves, in the world around us, and in each other. And ultimately, I would say that we seek to help those in need in whatever way we can, as an expression of those qualities that we're discovering and cultivating inside ourselves. That is a way of summarizing this idea of ethics and politics that Plato outlined. And I think it's an important message for us in the world that we're living in today. So I want to thank you all very much for your kind attention. I hope it was clear. I hope I didn't freeze too much. And I hope that there was something useful here to reflect on. As Connor mentioned at the top of the hour, we have a few minutes for some questions. I don't know if I'm just seeing here if there was any questions. Okay, so there's one question here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to jot them down. So the question, you referred to choosing to transcend an instinct. Can you give a practical example of how philosophy can help us? Well, I suppose, let me think for a second. Practical examples, there are numerous, really. Every day we have opportunities to practice this. But I guess the tendency that we have is to kind of expect big things. We're looking for always the big tests to demonstrate our mettle. But in reality, we have little tests every day. We have a dozen small opportunities to make that choice between the red pill and the blue pill, or as the question proposes it, to transcend an instinct. So the key really is to find the one that you're contending with. Because I can make lots of examples, they're not always relevant for everybody. Simple examples, getting up out of bed in the morning when the alarm goes off, instead of hitting the snooze button. Sounds simple, but not always easy, depends on the person. If we're at home and we cook and we eat and we have the dishes and we leave the dishes in the sink until tomorrow, instead of doing them right afterwards. They're small examples, and maybe they're silly, but in reality, they're important because every day these are opportunities to transcend the instinct, which is always pushing us towards comfort, towards the path of least resistance. So exercising a little bit of discipline, a little bit of will in practice every day helps us to, in a way, train ourselves to stay out of that comfortable path. But you can see that these are small examples. It's not simple. It's not easy, because every day we have to continue with perseverance to continue to kind of reinforce in ourselves that I'm not going to let the instinct take over. I'm going to do what my conscience tells me. So I suppose what I can advise is a practice in that, but it's a lifelong practice, practicing little things in little ways like that to help. So that's why I say it's for your reflection. What do you contend with? What is the difficult thing? Because that's always the best way to judge for yourself what you need to work on. What am I avoiding? Because what we're avoiding generally will tell us the thing that we need to work on. So a little honest reflection ourselves, and generally we can see what we. I hope that helps. That's it for questions. We are, so I guess we should probably wrap it up. But what I will say as well is, this, as Connor said, this was our first endeavor into the realm of virtual talks. So we would appreciate any feedback to let us know how it went. You can reach us at info@acropolis.ie. So, a quick email to let us know how it went, or if you have any thoughts, any questions, of course, we can follow up offline, or any suggestions for any topics that you would like to see for future talks. And also important to mention that we're continuing our activities online for those who are interested in studying more in this kind of line of or this approach. We're launching our first online course in philosophy next week, this coming Wednesday at 7:30 on the 13th, so this Wednesday. It's a 12-week course that we've created as a kind of an adaptation to the circumstances we're experiencing. We always look at an Eastern and Western comparative study in our philosophy courses, but our emphasis here is going to be addressing the concerns of the time, which is very much related to our current pandemic crisis. Specifically, what we've seen are people really want to see how to derive meaning from all of this experience. And above all, how do we prepare ourselves for what comes next? This, I don't know what, deconfinement process that we're going through. How do we reemerge into life in a different way, in a new normal that people keep talking about? Well, as Plato and many others have suggested, these external circumstances are best faced with inner moral character. So the emphasis of the course is to help us to awaken in us a strength of character that will help us in a practical way to live the experiences of now and of the future that are coming very fast. So it'll be a very practical and I'm sure dynamic course. It'll be hosted same as this on Google Meet. So if you're interested, you can find out more on our website, acropolis.ie. There you'll find an enrollment form, so you can sign up for the course and you'll get the link for the talks. The first 3 weeks will be free of charge, free to attend. You don't have to enroll. You can just get the link and you will be able to join. After that, it's €40 for the rest of the course. So it's at a special rate just to take into consideration that everyone is hit financially by what's happening. But then the whole 12-week course will be just €40. We're starting online, of course, but once all the restrictions are lifted, we will be reopening our centers in Rathmines and in Bray. So whatever the course starts, it'll continue in person eventually, hopefully sooner rather than later. As I said, you'll find out more on our website, and you can reach out to info@acropolis.ie if you have any more questions. For now, I guess that's all from us at New Acropolis. Thank you very much, and stay safe, everybody.